This is ContraZoom, where we go back and forth about film. I'm your host, Dakota Arsenault. As longtime listeners of the show know, I wasn't always a horror fan, but going back to episode 49, History of the Dracul, I started a yearly tradition of doing Halloween/horror specials. This included last year having Skinamarink's director Kyle Edward Ball come on to discuss his favorite Canadian horror movies on episode 258, or in honor of the documentary Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, Rachel Ho and I discussed the unholy trinity of folk horror movies on episode 171 and more. An idea that I've had for a few years now was wanting to check out Giallo films, as Dario Argento and the other Italian filmmakers were getting to be a pretty big blind spot for me as I worked my way through the horror canon. This year, though, it was fortuitous as the Criterion Channel put together a collection of Giallo classics, so it made perfect sense to finally do a dive into the genre. Joining me today in what is essentially him also dipping his toes into these movies is Matthew Simpson, one half of the Awesome Friday podcast and Cascadia Critics co-founder, who was heard just last week on our A24 retrospective episode on Mojave. So welcome back to the show, Matthew. How are you doing today?
I'm well, thank you. It feels like it's been so long since we spoke.
I know, it's been a whole 7 days, I think.
I mean, unless you count, outside of the show, in which case it's been approximately 12 hours.
Yes.
But no, I'm good. And I'm glad to be here talking about these films because they, I think, as you mentioned, are also a pretty big blind spot for me on the whole. So I was pretty excited to dive in when you invited me.
Nice. Excellent. So this is the first time that I watched any Giallo movie, and I felt like I had to do a bit of research. But to help me out, I checked out the Filmsplaining with Martin Strange podcast, and episode 206 Giallo was a great primer on the history of the genre and some of the classics it produced. I will link to the episode in the show notes because it's a really great listen. I think people should check it out as well. But in a nutshell, Giallo means yellow in Italian, and these movies got their title because they were based on a series of pulp paperback novels that were popular in Italy and all had yellow covers and were used as inspiration for these movies. The genre is defined by murder mystery plots where someone finds a dead body and they end up becoming the killer's next target by virtue of them trying to figure out who is behind the murder. They play out in a very procedural-like fashion with the police getting involved. They interview subjects and chase down leads. The films also feature a lot of gruesome deaths, often with over-the-top bright red blood, with the murder weapons being things like stylish-looking knives, straight razors, or shards of glass. The look of the films are bright, bold lights, lots of shadow play, and memorable costumes. And they are a version of exploitation films, often being very lurid and sexually explicit, with voyeurism being a big part of it. And the murderers end up usually being either sex-crazed maniacs or mentally unstable people that snap, with the intended victim often cracking the case, as the police are often quite inept. Mario Bava was the first filmmaker who started playing with elements that became mainstays with his 1963 film The Girl Who Knew Too Much, with his next film coming out in 1964 with Blood and Black Lace being considered the first true Giallo movie that would set the stage for all others that followed. The movie is about a model that is killed at a fashion house who kept a diary about the secrets of the people who ran the company and the other models they employed. This makes everyone a suspect as people try to figure out the content while also trying to keep their own secrets safe. The killer wears a black raincoat, black leather gloves, a black fedora, and a white stocking over their face while using various sharp instruments to murder anyone in their way, all future hallmarks of Giallo. Bava is considered the father of the genre, and Blood and Black Lace is one of the 3 movies we'll be focusing on today. The other movies we'll be talking about come from 2 of the other highest profile filmmakers, in Lucio Fulci and, of course, Dario Argento. By the time Fulci releases Don't Torture a Duckling in 1972, the genre had been going strong for almost a decade, and he helped bring a new spin on the genre by adding a bit more mysticism to his movies. In Don't Torture a Duckling, a series of children are murdered in a small Italian town, causing unrest in the community where mob justice is more likely to prevail over finding the killer, as any time a suspect is apprehended and the townspeople think the nightmare is over, another child dies. An out-of-town reporter and a promiscuous woman are the town's only hope of finding the real killer. And lastly, we'll be looking at Dario Argento's 1975 masterpiece, Deep Red. In it, a man witnesses a woman being murdered in his apartment complex, and while trying to figure out who killed her, he becomes a target of the killer too. Now, people might be wondering why we chose this film instead of the more well known Suspiria as the Argento pick, and it's because of two reasons. Firstly, it is argued about whether or not Suspiria is even a Giallo movie, since that movie deals with the supernatural and Giallos are more traditional murder mysteries. But secondly, and most importantly, it wasn't in the Criterion Channel collection, so we couldn't watch it. But considering how much I've enjoyed this deep dive, I may have to do a remake of Suspiria in the future. So, Matthew, all that said, I hope you have on your slickest raincoat, your tightest leather gloves, and your shiniest big pointy knife on you, because I want to know about your thoughts on the genre before we talk about each of these movies in order.
I mean, first of all, I'm not using a pointing knife. I'm using a meat cleaver because that is far more memorable. So I really liked all of these movies. We talked a bit before we started about like I actually watched the three we decided to talk about, and then I watched a couple more as well, and I'm excited to watch more still. Um, but in a very general way, I feel stupid for not having watched these earlier because they kind of are all bangers. Like there's of the three that we watched and the five that I watched total in the last like week and a half, there are no bad films. You know, there's better ones and worse ones, but they're all good and they're all fun and they're all lurid and sleazy in ways that I appreciate. And I'm excited to talk about them a little bit more in depth.
Yeah, I'm exactly the same way, where it was sort of funny where a genre I really love is film noir, and there's definitely a lot of overlap in terms of themes of what we're doing. You know, it's usually people dealing with shady underworld sort of stuff. There's murders going on, trying to cover it up. It's a race against the clock, all that sort of stuff. You never know who you can trust, all that fun stuff. So I love film noir, and there's definitely a lot of, you know, side by side. Oh, this is just sort of, taken to a different degree. And I also really love like, murder mystery sort of stuff. So it sort of combines those aspects and makes it a genre. And I I love following, physical media collectors, and very oftentimes, people who have large collections have a ton of horror movies that I've never heard of. But I also notice they all love Giallo movies, and for the longest time, I sort of rolled my eyes. I'm like, oh yes, another person who's got 500 obscure horror movies that no one's heard of, and half of them are Giallo movies. Great. And I'm watching these movies, and sort of just like you, I'm like, oh, that was excellent. I can't wait to watch another one. And so I put another one on. I'm like, that one was also excellent. Let's put another one on. And it didn't really matter who the director was. They all were great. They all are more or less the exact same plot. But it didn't matter because they were so much fun. And I'm glad that both you and I were sort of on the same page where, we put one on and we're like, oh, damn, no, that's legit. This is really fun and really great, and I'm going to enjoy watching every single one of these.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting. I don't know how you felt, but like, I definitely prefer the ones that are closer to film noir. Like, this might be a hot take. I'm not really sure. I'm not up on like the Giallo community consensus, but like, I think of the ones we watched, Blood and Black Lace is probably my favorite. Just to bury the lead a little bit here. Um, uh, but I like the ones that hew closer to film noir, closer to like murder mystery, and honestly, closer to like what we now considered like what we now notice a slasher to be. Like Blood and Black Lace is very clearly
Mm-hmm.
like one of the earliest like modern slasher horror movies, and I kind of adored it for that. And I really like your comparison with film noir because a lot of these films are basically like a film noir plot, but with intense key lighting, bright, colorful costumes, and ridiculous gore effects in the best way possible. Like that makes them sound cheap, and they're not cheap, but they're cheap in the best way possible.
Yeah. And like film noirs are also kind of, cheap in that similar way where, they would use some great shadow play to, highlight the character's eyes or things like that. But like, it's not like they were, you know, top of the line movies that were being made, especially in the 30s and 40s. These were, cheap, quick movies to make. And they're just replacing everyone having a revolver with everyone having some sort of knife or sharp object with some very. I think the one thing that all these movies kind of do was how can we make these murders new and interesting and fun looking in ways that other people haven't done it. And so I think every movie we watched, there was like, oh, I've not seen, a kill like this before in a movie. This is interesting. Or like, I've definitely seen versions of it since then being done, but from this era, it's like, oh, I haven't seen anything like this at this time.
Yeah, no, 100%, 100%. It's interesting because like with noir pictures, you sort of get the impression that whenever there's like a key light on someone's face, it almost feels like that's just the only light they have, and so they need to point it at
Hmm.
somewhere important. Whereas with Giallo pictures, they have so many lights that they're just like, okay, turn the brightest one on their face, and that's a really sort of subtle distinction, I think. But I think it kind of like explains a little bit about how they make these films. It's almost like they're taking film noir and just turning them into an Italian stereotype. I don't know if that makes sense. You know what I mean? But like that sort of like stereotype of like the loud, boisterous version of an Italian person compared to an American. That is like the difference between noir and giallo to me.
Yeah, that's fair. And then another thing, like depending on how much people know about their history of world cinema in Italy, for the longest time, even though sound was a thing, they weren't recording sound in their movies. I don't know when they started doing it, but all through the 60s and 70s, they were not recording sound while they were filming. So all of these movies were re-recorded and dubbed later on, even in their original Italian. And also they were worldly productions, so it would be co-financed by other countries. So that would mean that there would often be, Spanish actors and American actors and British actors and whatever Portuguese actors. And on set, they basically would just speak their own language, which like that's the same way like Sergio Leone movies. It was the same thing. Clint Eastwood would be speaking English, and everyone else around him would be speaking Italian while they were filming, and then they'd have to go in later and all dub it in whatever language they were releasing it for whatever market. And it's very much the same way. So like, if that's something that bothers you, this genre is probably going to bother you a bit. But like for me, it always is a little bit jarring if I haven't watched an Italian movie for a couple months, and then I'll watch it in like the first 5 minutes. I'm like, oh, this is kind of annoying. And then you just kind of like settle into the groove. I'm like, it's fine. Their lips don't match with what they're saying anyways. It's all good.
It almost becomes for me. It almost becomes a bit of a game to like when I know there's an actor who's speaking English. I'm trying to like match their lip movements with the subtitles,
Yeah, yeah.
which you know I don't always like dubbing. I think that there's definitely a time and a place where it works, though, and in situations like this one, I think it works. Um, as opposed to just like a modern movie where they've dubbed it rather than doing subtitles, where I think it doesn't generally work. But this, where they've clearly like it's been the plan from the start, I think that it does work.
Hmm. Yeah, and like for the most part, it looks like it's like I don't know if they're all speaking English while on set or not. I know the Italian actors were kind of doing their own thing, doing it in Italian, but like for the most part, it looks fine. Which compared to I think the often comparison would be something like martial arts films coming from Asia, from like the 60s and 70s, which received terrible English dubs to the point where it was like a point of mockery, where you'd have a character say one word, but like their mouth has been moving for like 60 seconds straight. We don't get any of that here.
No, no, not at all. Yeah, it's not egregious. Like again, it's not like it's clearly planned. You can tell that it's been how they wanted to make these movies or how they were limited to make these movies, not just that like you know throwing cheap dialogue over the action to make it make sense, just enough sense to sell. Um, it feels
Hmm.
planned and purposeful in a way that I appreciate.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, I picked out three movies for us to watch, and that was one of each of the sort of big three directors, because everything that I've sort of read about it, it really seemed like Bava, Fulci, and Argento are really like, the three godfathers of the genre. I know there's plenty of other popular filmmakers, but it sort of seems like anytime a genre becomes in vogue, you have the people that are innovative, and then not to be impolite, but you have the followers, or the people who are more reductive in just making copies of a copy sort of thing. And that doesn't mean that they're bad or they can't also be original in their own way, but it really sort of seemed that the three people pushing this genre forward were Bava, Fulci, and Argento. Was that something that in your sort of limited research and figuring out about this genre of filmmaking, were you sort of seeing that too?
Yeah, I sort of knew. I mean, I think most people who have any knowledge of film, understand Argento to be the most, maybe the biggest and most important of these filmmakers. But in the little bit of research that I did when I started watching, yeah, like Bava and Fulci uh, seem to be the two next most important ones. And in particular, Mario Bava being the sort of father of the genre, I think is one that I wanted to try and pay a little bit of attention to in a more close way, and I'm very glad that I did.
Hmm. Well, let's start talking about Blood and Black Lace. And you already, revealed that that was your favorite of the three that we want to talk about, and in general of the five that you've watched so far. And it's one that I really enjoyed too. And it's sort of striking how you can watch something and realize how sort of singular it is, because every other one we've watched, there's been like, oh, this is clearly taking elements from Blood and Black Lace. Like there is, the original movie, so to speak. So I didn't watch the his proto Giallo movie, which I kind of really want to sort of see what he maybe was like trying to figure out with, and then didn't quite nail it until Blood and Black Lace had sort of everything coming together. But it's definitely very interesting watching this movie about, a fashion house, which is just a fantastic sort of setting, because you've got, all these beautiful costumes in this, gorgeous setting of where it's both a workstation for seamstresses to make these beautiful clothes, and then a runway in the background, so you can have all of these models parading by, sort of thing, where it's got all that sort of stuff built in. So it makes sense why there's like so many purple lights and mannequins hanging around, and bold colors and bold costumes. All that stuff makes perfect sense for the setting of this movie. And it's sort of funny watching to see what elements are being repurposed by other filmmakers for their films that make perfect sense for this movie in particular.
Yes to all of that. Um, and also, you failed to mention that, like, you described the killer before with the black trench coat and hat and the faceless mask and everything. But I'd just like to point out that, like, this is the most stylish slasher murderer I think I've ever seen. Like, this person
Yeah.
really wears the shit out of that trench coat, is all I'm trying to say. Um, but I really appreciate. I think what really struck me about this one was, you're right about all the costumes and the color and the lighting and the location, but also, as I started to talk about before, that like you can draw a straight line from this to basically any like single location slasher film that's come since, like all the way to like you could draw a straight
Hmm.
line from this all the way to the Scream franchise, and that would be like an easy connection. Um, it's very easy to see, like, not just in terms of the other Giallo pictures, but like how much this film has influenced like modern cinema as a whole. And I always really appreciate finding films like that, the films where it's like, oh, this is the first one to do that thing, in the way that we know it be done today. And this is definitely one of those
Hmm.
films.
Yeah. And then there's some stuff that you know, I think what makes it so entertaining is how ridiculous some of these aspects can be. And so watching this first and then watching the others afterwards and sort of seeing what tropes were coming out, and like they kept referring to the killer as a sex crazed maniac. That's what the police kept calling him, a sex crazed maniac. And that was sort of like the root of basically every Giallo movie after that. It was like, oh, well, our first suspect has to be the sex crazed maniac. And you're like, what does that even sort of mean? Because like when we're watching it, we obviously, as the audience, know more than the other characters, because we're seeing all sides of the story basically, other than the reveal of who the killer is. And it's like, there's been like nothing related to sex or sex
Yeah,
crimes. Why is it a sex crazed
yeah, I was gonna
maniac?
say, like, he kills a bunch of women, and some of them are, in various states of undress, but there's not a lot of sex in this movie, not really.
Yes.
um,
Yeah.
but maybe that's just because of what they could and couldn't show at the time. Although, we're another one we're gonna talk about, or maybe not. Which one am I thinking of? There's a couple where there are lots of naked ladies in a lot of these movies, so maybe they could. But yeah, there's not a lot of sex or even like implied sexual stuff when the killings are happening for this to be a sex crazed maniac,
Hmm.
which I found a little bit interesting.
Yeah. But I did write down a quote. My favorite quote of the movie was, perhaps the sight of beauty makes him lose control of himself and kill. Which, like, I just paused the movie and rewind it because I had to make sure I got that quote right, because that is just a terrific
That's
quote.
such a great line. I didn't write down any lines from any
Yeah.
of these. I should have, but that is a great line. That's probably the, like I said, this one's my favorite of the ones we watched, and just everything about it, including lines like that, are what make it so. And it's also just the one where like all of these films take place in sort of heightened versions of reality, and this one, I think, because of the location, costumes, and all that stuff, is maybe the most that like it's the most dialed to 11 of the three. And
Hmm.
I always really appreciate that when a film sort of can put you into this other world in a way that still feels kind of believable. It's fantastic but relatable sort of thing, and I feel like this one accomplishes that best of the three.
Yeah, I would say, other than maybe Argento's films, which I feel he is probably maybe the most unique of the filmmakers of all the ones that I'd watched. A lot of them sort of seem like they were just taking what Bava did and like, oh, this is how you do it, and I'm just gonna do what he did. And so you see so many similarities. And once again, not saying that in a derogatory way, it just sort of felt like, oh, okay, well, this is how we do it, so we're gonna keep doing it like
Yeah.
this. And I think that maybe it would either become, I don't know if that would be more apparent or less apparent the more I watch. Maybe especially in the, this came out in, what year was this?
Mm-hmm.
1964. And the other movies that we're talking about don't come out till the 70s. And so I wonder if maybe the stuff that's coming out in like 1965 and 1966 is like really trying to capitalize on Blood and Black Lace. And so that would be sort of interesting to watch and see how the evolution starts.
Yeah, that's actually something I was thinking about before we started recording. That like, basically, of all the ones that I watched, this is the only one from the '60s. Like, even including the ones that I watched that we hadn't agreed to watch. So I would
Mm-hmm.
very much like to watch. I'm planning to watch a few more that take place in that like 6 7 year period between this and it's almost a 10 year period between this and Don't Torture a Duckling, where you might see
Mm-hmm.
some of that evolution happening and see like which things, because Hollywood today often acts the same way, right? Where something's successful, and so things about that successful movie are cherry picked and then used again and again and again in subsequent films
Mm-hmm.
by different filmmakers. And I kind of want to see like which things were picked up or cherry picked out and done in the following films.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um,
Because like it also feels like the
you,
later films feel, this film feels is very good. It's very well made, but the later films, the '70s films, all feel like, to me at least, that like where this film is trying to figure something out, the other ones all feel like it's figured out. You know,
mhm.
and so I would love to see. My plan is to try and see more that are still figuring it out. I guess is what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, 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 definitely. I sort of agree with what you're saying, and that's something I'm curious about too. As I'm now, done the primer level, it's like, okay, where do I want to start exploring next? And that's definitely something that I'm sort of interested in as well. And I think that kind of goes with any time you start diving into a new genre or filmmaker's work specifically, is you sort of start out with the most popular ones, or you start out in chronological order with the very first one, and then after that you've seen a couple, then it's a little bit easier to be like, okay, where do I want to jump around and explore next?
Yeah, 100%. It's pretty standard procedure for those of us who are film nerds, which I'm assuming that everyone who's listening to this probably is.
You were alluding to a movie that wasn't a part of our docket, but we both ended up watching to called "What Have They Done to Your Daughters?" In terms of being much more lurid in terms of sex crazed maniacs. I don't know if you want to sort of briefly sort of touch on not necessarily the comparison, but the difference between what Blood and Black Lace was doing with the so-called sex maniacs and sort of what have they done to your daughters sort of differs very
I mean,
greatly.
I would. I just want to point out one last thing before we move on from Blood and Black Lace entirely, though, and that is that so all these films are Italian, and so um, many of them have the same name in Italian as they do in English. But Blood and Black Lace's Italian title is Se Donne per l'Assassino, which means Six Women for the Murderer, which I think is a much better title, just for the record.
Oh yeah, yes,
And I
yes.
feel like it's a lot
And
of.
also once again, side
Sorry,
note,
was that?
I was just gonna say, once again, side note, the titles for basically all of these movies are absolutely fantastic. And like listening to that podcast I mentioned at the top, they ran through some of just their favorite titles, not necessarily movies. And there's so many. I'm just like, oh my god, why can we not have titles like this anymore in movies? I hate one word titles or the most boring, bland titles that Hollywood has today. Give me some crazy ass titles like Giallo movies
Yeah,
have.
yeah. But yeah, six women for the murderer, definitely the better title. And then the one we're going to briefly talk about now, the what have they done to your daughters? The original Italian title for that is La Polizia chiede aiuto, which means the police ask for help, which is which is kind of amazing. Like it's very basic, but it's also kind of amazing, you know.
Yeah,
But in that case, I
yeah.
think both titles are equally great. Um, so yeah, I'm just saying that like we're watching films from, you're right, a golden age of naming things, and it's great. Um,
Yeah. So tell me your bit of the thoughts on the differences of what have they done to your
yeah, I mean,
daughters.
what have they done to your daughters? So that's 1974, so a full decade later. And it's much more lurid. There's a lot more breasts. There's a lot more naked bodies. The victims are all young women. It's a little bit uncomfortable actually, because most of the naked people you see are underage, which is a thing, definitely a choice. But it's a little more grounded, like and it's a little sleazier would be the way I would put it. It takes place in a world that's much closer to our own, with a serial killer who is a sex crazed maniac, who's killing women and hanging their bodies and doing all kinds of terrible things. And then also there's a guy with a meat cleaver who rides a motorcycle, because of reasons. So it's a
Yeah.
little bit, honestly, it's a little bit less focused because of the way it's put together. I'm trying not to spoil it too badly. I'm doing a bad job, but it's a little bit less focused, but a little bit more, a little darker, a little sleazier, a little grittier. And I feel like it's sort of seized onto sort of what we were talking about a minute ago, where like they've taken the elements that they liked, they've taken the things that the genre has figured out work, and really sort of maximize them. And I think this is one of the early ones in that sort of trend towards Giallo pictures becoming like these police procedurals, right? Like there's a term for that
Yeah.
too, right? It's like poliziotto or something like that.
Yeah, that's what I was going to talk about as well, because this movie is considered sort of half giallo, half polizio, or I can't remember the exact
It's
name, but it
poliziottesco, I
basically
think.
is,
Is I
yeah,
should
which is basically just means police movie. Because that movie focuses more on the police investigation, where basically every other one, while there's police involved, they're sort of secondary to the plot, or like every once in a while pop up and be like, oh, this is the new information we have about the killer, sort of relaying that to the main person, sort of trying to figure out the identity of the murderer. Whereas what have they done to your daughters? They are the focal point.
yeah. Um, yeah, this one very definitely follows the police. And there's several levels of police, and they are to several different degrees involved in what's going on as well, on either end of it. So there's much more. It feels much more like a conspiracy thriller. It feels a lot less like a slasher and much more like a modern police procedural with some kind of like conspiracy twist, which is also pretty
Mm-hmm.
fun. I don't think it's quite as successful of a movie, but it's very fun to watch that, and you can sort of see the bones of like late 70s and especially like early 80s like police action movies from the States and Canada.
Yeah, yeah. It actually sort of feels like something like the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo franchise seems heavily indebted to what that movie was doing. Even something like Zodiac too. I feel like there was a lot of similarities to the way it was being structured to that movie, which was a very interesting watch for sure. And like I would say of all of them, not for the faint of heart, because it is probably the most realistic out of all of them.
It's the most realistic and the most graphic, I would say, of the ones we watched anyway.
Yes. Yeah.
um
Yeah. But it has probably one of the best car chase sequences like I've ever seen. Like it absolutely fantastic motorcycle chase sequence.
yeah, the motorcycle chase is great. um I would say the end of this movie is it's got the weakest ending of all the ones we've watched. Um, but the actual like mystery and procedural, and then yeah, the car chase is excellent.
Yeah. All right, let's move over to our second official one that we're talking about, and that's Don't Torture a Duckling. And this is once again yet a very evocative title. Do you want to read the Italian title for this, because I will absolutely butcher it, and your Italian seems to be much better than mine.
So we're moving on to
Don't
don't
Torture a
torture a
Duckling.
duckling. So this is actually the same name in Italian, but it's non si cervezia un peperino. And I will say that, like,
Love
as
it.
a person who has tried to learn Italian over the years for various reasons, I will also just want to cut in. Watching these movies has been great for my Italian. It's I don't know why I didn't make a point of watching a bunch of Italian movies before, but I can tell you in the last like week and a half, I can understand more Italian now than I could a week and a half ago for sure.
Yeah, that's fair. So this movie was interesting because I want us to kind of go in chronological order a little bit. So I watched this after Blood and Black Lace, and it feels so very different from that movie, at least at the start of it, before you start to notice some reoccurring tropes and trends that they are borrowing from Blood and Black Lace and Bava. But where Blood and Black Lace was like, how would I say it? Blood and Black Lace is like, if you're also watching Universal monster movies, it's basically like the Dracula, where everything is ornate and over the top and very confident and full of itself. Don't Torture a Duckling was very much the gritty cousin, where they're like, we're going to do it guerrilla style. It's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be clean, all this sort of stuff. And so it's just very interesting to watch the two one after another and sort of see the differences. It took me a little bit to get on its wavelength because of that. Whereas Blood and Black Lace, within the opening minute, you've got like this killer dressed in all black, being very stylish, and you're like, okay, I understand exactly what this is going for, and I'm here for it. Whereas Don't Torture a Duckling, it spends a bit of time setting up the plot and about the small Italian town and what's going on with these people, and then who these kids are, and then tragically starting to find their bodies and stuff like that. And so it leans a lot more heavily into the mystery element of we don't know what's going on, as opposed to Blood and Black Lace, where we're sort of seeing the killer in action at the same time that they're trying to figure out the mystery. This is very much a let's just show the mystery, and it plays out very much like you would expect a traditional murder mystery film, like a more modern murder mystery film to play out. But like I said, this is one that kind of took a little bit for me to get on its wavelength. How did this movie work for you?
So, without saying that it's bad, this is of the three we watched my least favorite, but it's still a good movie. But I basically agree with what you're
Nice.
saying. It does feel in a similar way to what have they done to your daughters? It does feel it's darker, it's grittier, it's sleazier. It's all of those things. And unlike Blood and Black Lace, I think the thing I appreciate most about it is that Blood and Black Lace is, again, to be clear, my favorite of them. But this one has a lot more to say. Has a lot more to
Yeah.
say about like um, you know, in particular about like how we react to justice being done or not, and about mob justice and
Hmm.
about sort of mob mentalities, and the insidiousness of like rumor and conjecture, and especially as someone from a small town, especially in a small town, the way that sort of news and opinion travel. And I found all that very compelling. I didn't really find it has a real supernatural element to it, which I didn't really connect with in the same way. Um, but I would not be surprised if this wasn't like I wouldn't be surprised if this was somebody's favorite. You know what I mean? Um,
Hmm.
it does feel like it's speaking to not to no one, but like to a very specific audience, and I bet that that audience loves it.
Yeah. I would say a big key difference between this and Blood and Black Lace is when you're watching Blood and Black Lace, the premise is there's a diary that goes missing, and in this diary has everyone's secrets. So right away we go, oh, anyone can be the killer. Whereas in this movie, we meet all these different characters and we're led to believe, oh, this person could be the killer. And I know it sort of sounds like it's not much of a difference, but when you're watching these movies, you basically have to go through the process of like, okay, this is this person's motive. Do we believe they actually are their killer? Now, once you start watching these movies, it becomes very quickly you realize you're like, oh, they're spending so much time trying to make this person seem like the bad guy. They're clearly not going to end up being the bad guy. Like it's when you watch like an episode of Law and Order where it's like, oh, this person is far too obvious to be the actual, you know, killer or whatever. It's going to be someone a little bit more subtle. And in this movie, it sort of starts a trend where like I noticed that in a lot of the other Giallo movies where we get, you know, the parade of characters where it's like, oh, is it the ex wife? Oh, or is it the business partner? Oh, is it this person? Oh, is it this person? Is it the mentally unstable sex crazed maniac sort of thing where it kind of goes through scene by scene, introducing us to new characters. It's almost a bit like a Scooby-Doo episode where we meet all these characters, we understand what their motives might be, and then we have to figure out by process of elimination which one is and isn't not.
Yeah, and then like the main character in this is an absolutely stunning woman who is sort of ostracized in the community and also not necessarily that sympathetic. And I think that's a pretty modern trope as well, to have the main character, the main suspect, who's clearly not the murderer from fairly early on, be someone who is maybe someone who you definitely believe could be the murderer, which I really
Mm-hmm.
appreciate. It's funny. It's funny you mentioned you know, who's going to be the bad guy and who's not. My one word review of this film when I logged it on Letterboxd was to be in my best Tim Curry voice. Gypsy magic was just a red herring. You know,
Yeah.
because that's the kind of movie this is. Like, it's that's probably a bit of a too much of a spoiler, to be totally honest. But I don't think it's going to diminish anyone's watching of the film. Um, because it does spend a lot of time, like a lot of modern police procedurals do, like building up a character only for it to not that person to not be the killer, even though they have like you know, ample motive and reason and opportunity, but they're just not. You know, it's I did
Mm-hmm.
kind of appreciate that aspect of it.
Yeah, yeah. And like you're sort of mentioning there with your comedic review, this movie sort of wants to lead the audience into believing it has more mystical element, and that's sort of where something like Suspiria isn't a Giallo movie because it actually does have these supernatural elements. In Don't Torture a Duckling, in this small town, there's a you know, like a gypsy family. There's a man who practices black magic, and so does his adult daughter. And so right away, we're led to believe, oh, the old man, you know, he uses his black magic for good, whereas the daughter doesn't. So we need to figure out where she is and who she is, and so she instantly sort of becomes the townspeople's main suspect. And we sort of learn, like, once again, trying not to spoil too much of the movie, but like, you know, it's not an actual mystical movie in the sense of like, oh, their magic and potions actually work, sort of thing. You know, it's stuff like voodoo dolls, and we're questioned of whether or not it actually works or not. And as a skeptic, you can watch this and be like, yeah, their magic doesn't work. But if, you know, maybe you have more tolerance or believability towards that, you can be like, oh, it does influence the plot in the story. So it's there. It's not overpowering, but it serves a purpose in a way that's sort of different and unique from stuff like Blood and Black Lace.
Yeah, and I would actually say that like the magic definitely doesn't work, right? Like this is a world where like it's
Yeah.
all superstition, but that doesn't mean
Yes.
that like the magic also does influence the plot, because it does. Like everyone in the story, everyone in the movie believes that it's at least possible. Like it's not. It's not a thing that's
Hmm.
actually happening. Um, but everyone in the village believes that they are probably involved. So like it does still have like a pretty significant impact on the plot and on the way the characters behave around everyone else. So I think it's actually pretty smart in
Hmm.
that way.
Yeah. And this has a pretty disturbing scene of mob justice being taken out of when one of the suspects is arrested and then later let go because there was not sufficient evidence to prove that was them, and
Uh,
a group of
not
men
just
from the
not just
town.
insufficient evidence, but like it's clear that this person is not the murderer. Just let's be clear. I don't think it's a spoiler to
Yes.
say that this person is not the murderer. Um, but then is
Yes.
brutally beaten to death by men from the village.
Yeah, yeah. In a way that feels a little too realistic, too.
Uh, yeah, I mean, some of the gore effects in the scene are definitely like, oh, that's clearly an over the top effect. But the tone
Yeah.
and execution of the execution, it's early. Um, it feels a little bit. It's very believable, right? Like, sure, the effects are a bit
Hmm.
like, oh, that's clearly not a real slash across that person's torso. Um, but the way that everyone is acting, behaving, and everything feels a little very close to reality in a kind of disturbing way.
Yes, yeah. And that's also a bit of a hallmark, too, where I feel like that's maybe the director sort of turning the lens onto us as viewers because it's like, oh, we're enjoying all these murders and how over the top gory it is. Well, we're also going to slide in one that, feels a little bit more believable and grounded. And, you might actually read about this story in the newspaper the next day or, see it online in today's day and age. And it sort of makes you go, oh, why was I, enjoying all of these killings? It's kind of morbid of me to do so.
Yeah, and I think this is the main scene that is really about how this film has more to say about the mob mentality and the spread of information and misinformation in smaller communities, especially. Um, and if the film has a major fault, I would actually say that it's that this scene is not followed up on enough within the rest of the
Mm.
plot. It resolves pretty quickly after this, um, and it doesn't not indict the men who beat this character to death, but it also doesn't really spend enough time doing that either.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And the final reveal of who the actual killer is doesn't have any real connection to that mob justice earlier. So it sort of loses its potency in that sense. But I would also argue that the politics behind who the killer is was probably one of the stronger and more realistic out of any of the movies that we watched because you understand a bit more of what had happened and what went wrong with this person for them to snap and act in this way, in a way that feels like, oh, yeah, I can imagine this happening.
Oh yeah, the ultimate reveal of who the killer is in this, I think, is actually really interesting and fairly well executed. All I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying is that like one more scene where these men realize the wrong they've done might have been useful. You know,
100%.
like
Yeah.
because there's no scene where like they're never shown to have to regret or even question their actions, which I feel is like one of the main faults of the movie. Um, which again is not to say it's
Mm-hmm.
a bad movie. It's just that like this one scene I think could have elevated it, for me at least, could have elevated it to be something a little bit more. Um, Especially given the like, without spoiling it too badly, like investigating those characters, like not only the spread of misinformation and their opinions based on what they've been told, but also their opinions about who they think this person is and who the real killer turns out to be, and maybe questioning some of their like it would allow the movie to show the audience some like questioning of our like institutions and understandings of people and such in a way that I feel like the film just sort of skips over at the end.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, that's fair. All right. I want to kind of talk a bit about Deep Red. Are you
oh
good to
yeah,
move on?
absolutely.
All right. Yeah, this was my favorite of the three, and immediately made me go and watch another Argento afterwards, the bird with the crystal plumage. And sort of what sort of shocked me is I know Argento is, regarded and one of the greatest horror movie directors ever, but I can't believe the assurity and the complexity of his setups, the way he frames everything. The details are just absolutely incredible in this film. In a way of like, we were talking about noir films at the beginning and how there's definitely some overlap genre wise from noir to giallo. And this sort of feels like, you've been watching a lot of like B noirs for a while, and then all of a sudden you watch one of the classics, and you're like, oh my god, this is why this genre can be so good. And this is watching Deep Red and The Bird with the Crystal Plumage sort of like really invigorated me of being like, okay, this is what you can do at your most creative and fantastical. So this was a movie I absolutely adored. I know you prefer Blood and Black Lace. But I'm correct in assuming you also really enjoyed Deep Red,
I
right?
did. I actually hold them in fairly close esteem to one another. I don't think either one is perfect, but I think they're both absolute bangers. And it's my number two of the ones we watched, but not by much. Like it's a fairly slim distinction. And I really enjoyed this one. I really enjoyed David Hemmings in it. Um, even like it's a difficult thing. We talked a little bit about the dubbing before, and it's a difficult thing to act through dubbing. But I feel like this is a case of the performer on screen and the performer doing the dialogue really matching up in a way that I think is fairly uncommon. At least in my
Mm-hmm.
opinion, is fairly uncommon. Uh, and I think that like everyone really understood the assignment in this one. Um, and
Yeah,
yeah, and the mystery is super satisfying as well.
yeah, it definitely is. Like we get this, pretty gruesome murder of a woman being impaled on a pane of broken glass as like that's her final death blow, and just sort of hanging there with her head held up by this glass pane, and such an evocative image, and it almost this movie felt a bit like something like The Conversation, Francis Ford Coppola's movie, in the sense of, are you trusting your own memory? Are you trusting your own thoughts? How does this work? And Argento plays around with this once again in The Bird with the Crystal Plumage of how do you remember the details of what you saw, what you heard, what you felt, all that sort of stuff, and getting into how things like testimony is the least effective method of catching a criminal. It's the actual evidence and details that matter more than anything. And I thought Argento did a really great job with that, and then sort of really built the suspense. None of these movies were particularly scary for me in any sort of way. A lot of the kills were over the top and ridiculous and quote unquote fun to watch. But this was the first movie that I watched where there was general moments that I felt real unease, specifically anytime David Hemmings' character Marcus is trying to investigate who the killer is and starts being stalked by the killer, and we'll get these scenes of like the killer on the other side of a door whispering, and that like super quiet whisper in the way the sound is done, where you can't tell if it's a male or a female voice, and it's so calm yet so threatening, like kind of chilled me a little bit, putting standing the hairs on my arm up sort of thing. And then there's also one moment where a wind up doll comes out of nowhere, and that sort of caused me to jump up a little bit there, where like I was not expecting that to
I mean,
show
I don't
up.
think anyone was expecting that to show up. Who's ever watched this film?
Because
It's sort
it,
of out of nowhere, but in a
yeah,
delightful way. And like,
yeah,
and it's one of those things too, where I think the film is really brilliantly constructed because if that doll had shown up in the first act instead of the third, you would have been like, "What the fuck is this?" Um, but because it comes in
yes.
the third, and because there's already been this buildup of like, um, uh, not only tension but also like mild weirdness, that by the time it does happen, you're already so deep into it that you're like, "Yeah, this is perfect. This works exactly right." And I think it's a real
Hmm.
testament to the way the film is constructed. Uh,
Yes, yeah, it was building layers of tension to get to that
Yeah, but
point.
not only layers of tension, but also layers of David Hemmings' character, like remembering and misremembering and finding out, and finding out one thing and then finding out more details that are all a little bit more and more fantastic and weird and disturbing. And so by the time this like disturbing clockwork thing shows up, you're like, it's just, you're so like frog boiled into it that it works. Again, in a way that like if it showed up earlier in the film, it would just kick you right out of it. But it's so well put together that
Yeah.
it works 100%, which I think is amazing.
What did you like for all the films that you watched? What did you find the sort of personal fear factor level for you? Like for me, almost all of them were not scary in the slightest, but I would say Deep Red probably had me the most on edge throughout.
So none of them are scary, and maybe that's just because it's
Yeah.
2024 and these films were made in the 60s and 70s, and our ideas of scary and our execution of scary is a lot different today than it was then. Um, but Deep Red is probably the one that had me in the most unease, or at the very least, I would say perhaps the most concern for the protagonist when he was in danger. And he's in danger a
Mm,
lot, you know. He is being, not only because he's being stalked by, in investigating this murder, he is being stalked by the murderer, but also because of all the other protagonists, he's probably the least qualified to be investigating a murder. He's a musician, he's a jazz musician. Um, the other protagonists are all, like reporters and police officers and people like that. And so this guy is sort of like, not that he's unintelligent, but he is kind of like bumbling around. It's probably the wrong word, but he's kind of like bumbling around through this mystery trying to figure it out. And he's not really qualified to be doing so. And so every time he's being stalked by the murderer, I'm like, he should probably be dead by now because like he doesn't
yeah,
really know what he's doing. Um, so I really liked that sort of put me on edge a little bit, having him just be kind of not a
yeah.
nobody, like, but kind of like not an appropriate person to be in the place that he is, which is good.
Yeah. I would also say that this movie, a lot of the movies had a lot of unintentional comedy. I thought Deep Red had the best intentional comedy, and that was specifically coming from the performance of Daria Nicolodi, who plays Gianna, who is a reporter, I believe, yeah, she's a reporter in this film, and sort of is a love interest to David Hemming's character on and off, but they decide to sort of team up in their investigation. But her character in general, basically every time she's on screen, has some great one-liners, has some great physical comedy aspects, brings out sort of the best in everyone around her. And I was like, who is this woman? And then I realized that like she was Dario Argento's wife for like a decade, and so she's in a bunch of his movies. And I absolutely adored every time she was on
Yeah, and
screen.
I think it's really smart that in this film that is otherwise very serious, she's always there to just take the piss out of all of it. Like every time anything
Yes.
happens, she just is there to be like, no, this is stupid. like,
Yeah.
um, and I think perhaps of all the ones we did watch, this one gets that balance right. Of the like the dark,
hmm
of the heinous and the hilarious. This one gets that balance right, the most right. Um, and you're right, entirely because of her.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of the movies will balance, the darkness with sexiness. This movie balances the darkness with comedy. So I think it works on like a very, very modern horror movie aspect where you sort of need to cut the tension with a little bit of humor, because then that allows the audience to breathe and let their guard down, and then when the tension starts up again, you tense back up really quickly, as opposed to like when it's tense the whole time, you're like, okay, yeah, I'm supposed to be tense right now, I get this is a scary moment, but allowing the audience that relief really does help and be able to build the suspension back up very quickly afterwards.
Yeah, and it also just like makes the protagonist make a little bit more sense too, because like I say, he's not really qualified, but she is. And so every time
hmm
he's like agonizing over something, and then she'll occasionally show up and be like, "Oh, it's this," and he'll be like, "Oh, right, of course." Like anyone who was qualified would know
yeah.
that. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
it's like I say, I've all this. I still stand by. I think Blood and Black Lace being my favorite of these three, but I think this one is by far the best constructed of the three.
hmm And I was also quite impressed that an Italian movie from the 70s, sort of dealing with a queer subtext story for a couple of its characters, was, for the most part, handled incredibly well and sensitively in a way I just was not expecting whatsoever. At no point were any of these characters a punchline for their sexuality as well, which was, or their gender, which was very interesting, and including with like gender comments back to the Gianna character. She has this whole bit about Marcus as being misogynistic towards her, about like, oh yeah, women are, not strong and they're weak or whatever. And she's like, I'll beat you in an arm wrestling contest. And then
Yeah,
she does, twice. So like, I'm like, it just, this movie feels very modern for the most part in terms of structure, in terms of tone, in terms of, not making fun of its characters in a way that a lot of these movies kind of do, where a lot of these movies are like, oh yeah, what's this person's problem? Oh yeah, they're a sex crazed maniac. Yep, that explains exactly who they are. And you're like, what? Okay. Deep Red felt like Argento actually took some real care into figuring out who these characters were.
yeah. I think that's a really well stated way to put it. And not only who they were, but like when to build them up and when to knock them down. Uh, I think
Hmm.
it's very intelligent. Uh, I'm just going to repeat myself again. Like intelligent and well constructed at every level. Really,
Hmm.
it's funny because like the movie, the only sort of uh, Giallo film, although we've already established it's not really that I had really seen before this, was Suspiria, and I know a lot of people sort of revere that as his masterpiece. But I think this is a better film. I think it's
Hmm.
a better made, better put together, and more. Not that Suspiria is bad by any, just for the record, but like I think that Deep Red is perhaps more compelling as well, just at every level.
Yeah, I haven't seen Suspiria yet, so I can't comment. But maybe we can use this moment to sort of transition a little bit to talk about the bird with the crystal plumage, because I put them on almost equal tiers. I think I gave them both 4.5 stars out of 5. In terms of I just enjoyed how well thought out and structured both of these movies were. I think both movies sort of had a bit of an issue with the ending coming super
Mm-hmm.
quickly, where it's like, oh, here's the reveal and end credits. And you're like, okay. Which is a bit of a problem with movies in general from this era. Like, go back and watch, Alfred Hitchcock movies. They'll be like, and then this is the reveal, and then we kiss and the movie is over.
I was going to say that like this that feels kind of like a hall. We haven't really talked about it, but it kind of feels like a hallmark of the genre from the ones we've watched as well. Like even don't torture a duckling. Goes from that brutal mob execution to and here's the bad guy and here's the end credits. Like it's they
Yes.
all kind of do that to some extent or another. Um, but, and yeah, I think that this one, bird with the crystal plumage, is definitely guilty of that too.
Yeah, it very much is a modern way of making movies of we're going to deal with the after effects of what had just happened. So, you'll get the climax and then you've got another, 15, 20 minutes of the movie going on. Whereas it feels like not just Giallo, but in general, a lot of movies from, the 70s and earlier, for the most part, would just end with the climax, and you're just sort of left on that high with no real conclusion of like, oh, what's the follow-up, does anyone get arrested, or what is their lives like after this, are they impacted, or do they stay together? You don't really get any of those answers. You just sort of get to the climax, and that is
Yeah, there's no
it.
denouement. There's no like. There's in a lot of cases. There's not even like a snappy one-liner to close on. It just sort of stops. Or I
Yeah.
guess in this case, in the bird with the crystal plumage, there's a news report, which is something, I guess. But yeah, you are correct in what you're talking about.
It's funny because we get the reveal of the killer, but we don't get the motivation. And then it's literally this news report that's happening as the credits are starting that sort of reveals what the motivation was for the killer. And you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense.
It does definitely feel like something that could have been worked into the first 20 minutes of the movie, though, doesn't it? Like,
Yeah,
like I really
yeah,
liked this movie as well. I also gave it, I think, a 4 out of 5. But yeah, the ending is abrupt. Would be the politest word I can think of.
yeah. Much like Deep Red with David Hemming's performance. I really love Tony Musante's performance in this as the lead character. I think he does an excellent job. Honestly, I would say all of these movies, there was at least one standout performance in all of the films we watch where you're like, okay, this isn't just, a bunch of, nobodies. There's some actual real talented actors being involved in these films. And I really appreciated what he brought. I would maybe say this movie had the best acting out of all of the ones that I watched, even if not all of the character development and choices work. But the actors themselves, I think, were probably the best overall.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. Yeah, I think you're right that every film has at least one standout. But yeah, I think I think all the acting in this one is on point. There's no one who stands out. Uh, there's no one who stands out as truly as like the greatest of them to me, because there's also no one who stands out as like the worst of them. Um, it's everyone is firing on all cylinders in this movie.
Yeah. I will say the inciting incident in this was absolutely terrific. It's this man walking alone on a street at night, and as he's walking, he sees across the street in an art gallery, an empty art gallery, a woman being attacked by a man in a black trench coat and black
Of
fedora, of
course.
course. Of course. And as he is seeing this going on, he almost gets run over by a car. So he loses track of what's happening. And then the next thing we know is the woman is on the ground. She's trying to crawl. There's blood coming out of her stomach, and the killer has disappeared. And he ends up going into, there's like a vestibule in this art gallery where it's glass on either side, and the killer traps him in. And he's just stuck there watching this woman bleed out, and we have no idea whether or not she's going to survive, what's going to happen to him. And that setup alone I thought was really fantastic and a great way for Argento to set the stakes of this movie. And the fact that everything was glass, the art gallery was all white, so everything was very bright and we could see everything, I thought was an excellent creative choice for him to do.
Yeah, not only well lit so you can see everything, but it really makes, like, there's some blood effects that really stand out really gorgeously. And it's also like
Mm-hmm.
anyone who's been to like an art gallery or a jewelry store is pretty familiar with the sort of like double locked doors you need to go through to get in and out. But just the location in itself of this gallery and the way it's set up is not only it's like a little more intense than some of the other ones in real life might be, but in a way that is totally believable and gorgeous to look at. And yeah, it's great. Everything you're saying about this is great.
It almost feels like the guy watching this happen was a art exhibition himself by being trapped between the two panes of glass. It almost feels like, oh, this is a performance art being put on by the killer where he is going to make him watch someone die.
Almost, yeah. Or it's too early in the morning for me to be having this thought. But basically, that like him being trapped in the glass puts him in a frame for us to watch as well in a way that I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
So it's he's watching
Mm-hmm.
one performance and we're watching his, and there's sort of that layer of abstraction for the audience, which I think is really interesting. Um, but like
Yeah.
it's incredible that this is Argento's first film as a director. He'd obviously written a bunch of films before this, but it's pretty incredible how well shot and well staged and how confident this film is as his first
Yeah.
directed film.
Yeah, I was texting you while I was watching this, where I was blown away. I could not believe that this was his first film, because so often when you watch a director's first film of someone that ends up becoming great, you're like, oh, I see the nuggets of where they're figuring out their style and what would maybe become hallmarks or things that they will reuse or improve upon, but there's still a little bit of rust there where they're figuring stuff out where it's like, okay, you're pretty basic with your setups for 15, 20 minutes, then you do something really interesting, and then it kind of goes back to being a little bit basic. This whole movie, I was impressed with everything. Every choice that Argento was making was kind of blowing me away. And there was multiple times, whether it was a shot or an edit or a reveal, where it kind of left me audibly going, oh, wow, that is a fantastic choice that he was making. And like you mentioned, Argento had written a bunch of movies before. He grew up in the film world because his father was a producer. So I imagine he had spent, at this point, I don't know how old he was, probably a couple decades watching his father work on sets and seeing how other directors do their jobs and sort of learning the craft that way.
Yeah, the Bird with the Crystal Plumage came out in 1970. He would have been 30, I believe. So yeah, he definitely grew up
Yeah.
in watching this stuff. And just to extend what you're saying, like, to me, what's incredible is just that, yeah, what you're saying about how, like, you watch the director's early work and you see the sort of like bones of what they're going to become, like as they become more assured and as they sort of figure out their own style. And this one feels figured out from the first frame. Like everything about
Mm.
it feels like, oh yeah, that's an Argento film. Like these are all the hallmarks of an Argento film. Um, and like there's no rust, to use the word you used. It just feels like his film. It feels like he
Yes.
was figured out from the get go, which is very impressive.
And it was one of these things where I watched both Deep Red and Bird with the Crystal Plumage, and I didn't know what order they had come out, and I didn't know that one of these was his debut film. And if you had asked me immediately after I watched the second one, okay, what order did they come out and which one was his first ever movie, I would not have been able to answer that question, either of those questions, because they both were so shockingly well put together in a way that's like frustrating and be like, how can you be that good and for your first movie?
Yeah. I mean, I think the only reason I might have been able to answer that question is I'm pretty sure that in Deep Red they mention the year. Um, but
Mm.
that's cheating. So, no.
But I didn't know when Crystal Plumage came out, so like there wasn't that to go against it. So I didn't know if it came out after or
Yeah, that's
before
fair.
it.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
with you. Like I say, this film, it feels like Argento was a fully formed director from this moment on, and this being his first film makes that incredibly impressive.
Yeah, and as someone who has seen Suspiria, because I said I haven't, watching these two and sort of comparing it to Suspiria, do you sort of see where he was sort of getting his own vision and own style and what he was trying to do differently with Suspiria? Like, do you have anything you could kind of like do like a connective tissue between those three films?
Honestly, it's been a long time since I've seen Suspiria, so I can't think of anything off the top of my head, other than to say that like Suspiria definitely also feels like a complete vision from a director who fully understands his own um, preferences and styles, in the same way that both Bird with the Crystal Plumage and Deep Red do. And yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we talked a lot about shot construction and performance, and those are both also incredibly on point. And especially, actually, from Deep Red to Suspiria, would be the use of color. Um, is an incredible
Mm.
through line. You can definitely see his one that one evolution would be that like he from Crystal Plumage to Deep Red to Suspiria would be that like he seems to get um, I don't know if color theory is quite the right way to put it, but like the way that color stands out on screen, the way that color is used to highlight things and um, to highlight reactions, to highlight effects, to highlight performance, or even just props, or emotion in a scene, gets more pronounced in Deep Red from Crystal Plumage, and then again in Suspiria from Deep Red.
Mm, that's fair. That's fair. And I think one other thing we haven't talked about in terms of what makes a lot of these movies great is the score. And we're talking about two Argento films here. With The Bird with the Crystal Plumage for his debut film, he enlists Ennio Morricone to do the music. And then for Deep Red, he's got the psych rock group Goblin, who I know did quite a few of his scores, and both of them are just such standouts. And then I watched the last one that I watched, you watched as well, was What Have You Done to Your Daughters? And I wish I had the name in front of me of who did this score, but what a fantastic score that movie has. I love the music of these films where they sort of don't quite fit what you would expect a horror movie score to be like, but also are exactly what you need.
Yeah, um, they feel kind of like what's the right word? I don't know the right word for this, but they're very jazzy, very uh, jazzy is maybe not the right word. They all have like really heavy bass lines, and then a really satisfying hook in the music that really draws you in. And the music sometimes doesn't feel necessarily appropriate, but after about 5 seconds of listening to it, you're like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I can get with this. That's great. This is great.
Yeah.
Um, the music in What Have They Done to Your Daughters was done by a guy called Stelvio Cipriani, um, who also did
And the theme in that was just
yeah,
so
the theme of
good.
that one is maybe actually the best of them, in my opinion. Just
Mm-hmm.
every time there's a scene with police investigating a crime scene, this really thick bass line comes on that feels, again, the first time you hear it, you're like, really? But by the second or third time, you're like, yeah, really. Like every time it comes on, you're like,
Yeah.
yeah, they're investigating the shit out of this scene. It's great.
It really does feel like that. That's exactly how it's going. Where like hell yeah, you're gonna find those clues. You're gonna figure out
Yeah,
who the killer
exactly. Like
is.
it's such a weird. It's almost discordant at first, but then as soon as you get on its wavelength, you're
Yeah.
like, hell yeah, this is exactly correct.
Yeah, yeah. Deep Red was one that felt a bit out of place at times because it was such a jazzy, upbeat score, but for the most part was only playing it when the killer was in action. And you're like, okay, this is interesting. But then he would also, I feel like he also knew when to have no music whatsoever, and you're just dealing with the silence and hearing, heavy breathing and whispering and things like that. And so the contrast was always like so pronounced and noticeable in a way that I really
In
appreciated.
Deep Red, the one that really stuck out to me um, was there's a scene where David Hemming's character is like investigating this supposedly haunted house, and he ends up dangling from the side of the house, and it's a basically musicless scene until he's dangling and in danger, and then this like jazzy, funky music comes on as he's dangling from the side of the house, and
An
it's an
absolute
absolute
banger.
banger. It shouldn't work. It shouldn't work, but it really does.
It was really funny because I was watching these movies with headphones on because it was while my wife was working, and at that point she had come and sat next to me on the couch, and I was like, "Listen to this music." And it was that exact scene, and she's like, "Oh,
Yeah,
this is fun."
yeah. It's interesting how that, and I think it's probably safe to say it's sort of another hallmark of these Giallo pictures that like um, the music is often fun, even in scenes that aren't necessarily fun, which is maybe not the most articulate way to put that, but like it sort of works, right? Like in these
Yeah.
scenes where it should be harrowing, but then this music comes on and you're just like, yeah, he's in danger, like bobbing your head as he's like in danger, like it's pretty fun.
Yes. Yes. Well, I think that's a pretty great way to maybe wrap our conversation up here a little bit, but I'm going to put you on the spot here. After watching these five movies, were there any that you're like, okay, I now need to check out based on this, whether they're from that collection on Criterion Channel or doing maybe deeper dives on some of these directors? Are there any titles that you're like, okay, I've added these movies to my watch list that I got to check out?
So there's none specifically, but now having watched five from this collection, so there's let's see, there's 12, about 15 or so in this collection on Criterion Channel right now. And my plan is to watch all of them, basically. Um, Not all of them because, like, so What Have They Done to Your Daughters is in there twice, once in Italian and once in English. I might watch the English one long enough to determine if the English dubbing is good enough. Um, but basically,
Mm-hmm.
all of the ones that are in here are ones I plan to watch now. Um, so there's a lot of Mario Brava, there's a lot of Dario Argento, um, and I can't wait to watch all of it. Basically, I also went looking. There's a number of Jello
Yeah.
pictures on Tubi for those who are interested, and I will probably seek those out as well. Honestly, the only thing that's holding me back from watching more, just in the next, like, this is today as we're recording, it's the 27th of October, and the only thing that's holding me back from watching more, even like just today, is that I have been working my way through the Universal Monsters box set that I own, and my goal is to do that before the end of the month. So I have two more to watch there first before I can continue with Giallo Pictures. But then I think I'm going to continue with Giallo Pictures basically for the rest of the year. So yeah,
Yeah, that's probably going to be anytime I have free time where I'm like, oh, I don't have to watch a movie for the podcast. Let's see what Giallo movies I could find. But in particular, ones that stood out for me that I really want to check out from Bava, Black Sunday, and Bay of Blood. And from Argento, I really want to watch Tenebrae and The Cat of Nine Tails, and then of course get to Suspiria as well. But really, yeah, there's so many where I'm just like, okay, yeah, like the setup for all of these movies is basically identical. Oh, someone gets murdered and the killer is on the loose, and someone's tracking them down. Will they find out the killer in time? That's literally the description for all six movies
yeah,
I
and I mean
watched.
honestly, so I'm obviously super inclined to watch Argento and Bava especially. Um, but the thing that's attracting me most to films in this, at least in this Criterion collection, are I kind of just want to watch the ones with the most interesting titles. So I'm really excited to watch In the Folds of the Flesh and Death Walks at Midnight and Strip Nude for Your Killer. Like it's like at this point, I'm pretty confident that I'm going to like all of them. So I just kind of want to watch the ones that have the most salacious and outrageous titles, which I know is the shallowest way to approach this, but I don't care. These movies sound amazing.
Honestly, that's how this genre should be explored anyways, because everything is so sleazy and over the top. The ones with the craziest titles should hopefully reflect
Yeah,
that.
like why would I want to watch a movie called Torso when I could watch All the Colors of the Dark?
I will say I watched Torso, and my one comment I'll say about Torso is the characters in this movie seem more interested in just hanging around naked than they are concerned for the killer on the loose that's chasing after them. So
So
it is
let me
probably,
just be clear. I don't expect Torso to be bad. I'm just saying that I am more drawn to the pictures that have titles that draw me in. Like, yeah, I could watch Torso. I'm sure it'll be good. I'm sure there'll be a lot of naked people. I'm sure there'll be a killer on the loose and a satisfying mystery. Or I could watch Who Saw Her Die. You know, it's it's just the thing I'm enjoying about them in this moment is all I'm saying.
yeah. No, that's 100% fair, and I totally get where you're coming from, and I'm on the same page. Matthew, I really want to thank you for coming on. I'm so glad you had as much fun that I did, and that like I don't think I've ever done where a genre or a theme for this podcast where I'm like, oh, I'm gonna pick out 3 movies and just watch those. I watch those 3. I'm like, I immediately need to watch more of these. I have never had that happen to me for an episode of this podcast. So thank you for coming on this journey and being like on the exact wavelength I needed for this.
Oh no, of course. I've never had that happen on this podcast either, so that works out for both of us. But no, I really enjoyed it, and one of the things I like about your show, and there's one other show that I like being on, is oftentimes when I join you, it's for something that I either haven't seen before or some blind spot, and I just want to say that I really appreciate that this is the way I came to Giallo, by like watching these films and getting to talk about it with you. Um, and again, like filling in that blind spot in my canon, and I really enjoyed it. And I really enjoyed talking to you about it.
Hell yeah. Awesome. Well, where can people check out your work, and what's your show going on right now? What do you have going on?
So, as stated at the top of the episode, I am one half of the Awesome Friday podcast. We review 2 movies every week. Me and my podcasting partner Simon. So you can find that show anywhere that podcasts are podcasted, by searching for Awesome Friday Podcast. We're on all of the platforms. And what are we doing this week? This week we're doing the new Netflix movie Don't Move and Woman of the Hour, both of which are interesting, and I look forward to talking about. I'm also a freelance writer for a number of publications. You can find links to basically all of my work and social media just by going to my personal portfolio website, which is stretched.ca.
And of course, all of that will be in the show notes for people to check out. I love Awesome Friday. It's one of my favorite podcasts to listen to, and the couple times I've been on has always been a pleasure as well. So thank you again for coming on today, Matthew.
No, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure. And let me just say, if you ever want to do like a Giallo 2, I am here. Just say.
I might have to do that, maybe.
I feel like we've really enjoyed it, and maybe like we should get, I'm just spitballing live on the air here, but like you and me, and I don't know, let's get Rachel back to talk about like a bunch more of these movies, maybe later Giallo or something. I don't know. Again,
Yeah,
just
maybe,
spitballing.
maybe.
Cut this part out if you have to, but I would really enjoy that.
No. This has been a That Shelf podcast. Visit thatshelf.com for more great film discourse. Follow the show on Instagram, Twitter, and Threads at ContraZoomPod. Have you seen any of these 3 Giallo movies or any others that we're talking about that we should definitely see? Please let us know. Send an email to ContraZoomPod@gmail.com or leave a note, a comment on Spotify. Thank you to Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music and to Stephanie Pryor for the logo design. If you like to listen to podcasts on YouTube, we do post all episodes there as well. And if you really like the show, consider tipping us on coffee. Thanks for checking us out.